Don't ask me what I feel about myself. Ask me what I know about God. Ask me what I know about His Word.
I just realized something. He wasn't sleeping on a pillow. He was sleeping on purpose.
Something to say I think is important but not essential would be like the inerrancy of Scripture.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I hold to the inerrancy of Scripture.
Okay.
Title of my sermon tonight is Why Church Nurseries Are Unscriptural and Wrong. And so that's why I have a baby on my hip right here.
There is a level of anointing that I believe is going to invade your homes, invade your sight, invade your senses. That's going to, I literally feel that chains are going to break off of you.
Do you think I'm wrong? Yeah. Yay! So am I a bad guy for saying you're wrong? Yeah. I am? Yeah. That's not fair.
Hey, by the way, you are a slave. If you're not a slave of Christ, you're a slave of sin. You aren't free. Choose your master.
Give us some men who know the truth.
What are you drinking? I know you're a connoisseur. What do you got there?
Yeah, this is Black Rifle Coffee Company Murdered Out. Their dark roast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so freshly made.
You got a particular way you're committed to making coffee?
Not really. This morning was a pour over. My wife is dead set against Keurigs for whatever reason. So we went away from the Keurigs, and to get single cups of coffee is now pour over. So she bought into the pour overs. If I want for more than one cup, I usually try to do French press. But this morning was a pour over. But I didn't have the coffee ground well enough for the pour over. It was more for a French press grind. So it's not the greatest cup of coffee, to be honest with you.
Okay, all right,
but it's okay.
But no drip, huh? No Mr. Coffee, plug it into the wall there and drip machine. That's what I got going on.
Yeah, she had that. That's what she got rid of when we bought the Keurig. That's what she got rid of, the Mr. Drip. And then when she couldn't get my wife doesn't like coffee. She likes creamer that's somewhat flavored like coffee.
Uh-huh. I know the type.
So she couldn't quite get the taste right with the Keurig. So then we went back to the Mr. Coffee machine. But when we left Norway, we lost it for a long time, and then so she got into the pour overs, and then now that she got the pour overs, she doesn't want to go back to the Mr. Coffee machine. So, we have a hot pot and a pour over. So
good for her. I mean, it is much more aesthetically pleasing. You don't see anybody posting pictures on social media of their Mr. Coffee machine. So.
That's true. I think a large part was the clutter. She's anti-clutter, and one of the large things was she didn't like how it would take up kitchen counter space. So
okay, gotcha. Yeah, it makes sense. Totally makes sense. And so you're in Ohio now. Are you back to your hometown? Is that where you ended up? Is back where you started?
Yeah. Back where I started. Yeah. We're about 10 minutes maybe from the house I grew up in. We found a little home here recently, and so we've been, I think, moved in since about November, I think. And the main reason for coming back home was this time last year, we didn't know if I'd be alive at this point. It was so such a rare cancer, and such a not much is known about it, that we didn't know how much time I had. So we were preparing for the worst, and so we bought a little travel trailer and put it on my mom and dad's property, and we're living in that travel trailer up until October. And so even to this day, we really don't know. Every 3 months, we really don't know what's going to happen. The doctors don't really know. The best guess they had, they started off a 70-30 chance it would come back. Now they're around 50-50. But because of that, I didn't want to deprive my family of the final, months or however long I had to live. So we decided to stay in the area. We're about hour and a half drive from the cancer hospital, the cancer center that I've been attending, the James Cancer Hospital in Columbus. So it's a relatively easy drive. It's about an hour and a half, but for anybody that's been on deputation as missionaries, an hour and a half is nothing. So it's actually quite a short drive. But that's the main reason we're back here. And it is quite interesting. I've been gone for the better part of 20 years. And in some ways it's the same. In a lot of ways it's changed a lot. I literally haven't talked to anybody that I graduated high school with for 20 years. Maybe a short conversation on Facebook, happy birthday or something like that. But and I think one time when I was back from the military, I had some guys over for a campfire, I think, but outside of that. So now I'm getting to see everybody. I get to see what they've been doing for the past 20 years. And
so is it like a smaller town? You came from a smaller high school then? That's the vibe I'm getting, is that you knew everybody or whatever in your class?
Right. It's the city itself. There's a city of Portsmouth. I don't really live in Portsmouth, although my address is Portsmouth. I think the county at large is 20,000 people. The town, the high school that I went through has about, I want to say 4,000, 5,000 people. Those are not exact numbers, but I'm guessing. So yeah, it's around, it's not extremely small. I've lived in smaller towns, but 6,000 is smaller than most, I guess.
Small Midwest town. That speaks to my heart. That's where my wife and I are from, is a small lower Midwest town in central Missouri. But my graduating class had 38 people. So
my wife's from Centralia, or
oh, really?
Yeah, so she's
wild.
Well, not Centralia. Sorry, that's where her aunt lives.
Well, I know where Centralia is. That's
Hallsville. Hallsville is like about 20 minutes north of Columbia. That's what it is.
Okay, gotcha.
So she lives about 20 minutes north of Columbia.
Yeah, my wife and I are from Sedalia, Missouri. So
okay.
Yeah, Highway 50 runs right through it.
Yeah, we go down there. We'll have to meet up, man. We go down there every Christmas season. If you're free, we're down there for usually like 2 weeks or something. Maybe we can meet in the middle.
Well, yeah. We're actually we're only there in the summers because I've been a pastor in Utah for the last 9 years. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we're out here mingling with the Mormons. So.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to talk to sometime, because we don't really get many Mormons around here. We have a lot of Amish communities around here. Actually, that's like probably I wouldn't necessarily call them. I guess they would be considered a denomination of some sort, but lots of Amish communities. We buy most of our furniture from them because it's just a little bit more expensive than buying stuff from like Big Sandy or a furniture store. And you're getting like handmade stuff from the Amish, and
you're getting stuff that your grandkids will use.
Yeah, and they're much more honest when they try to sell you stuff. Like, this is going to go wrong, this might not go wrong. And most of the outdoor furniture we have has like lifetime warranties on it. So I didn't see a problem spending an extra $100 to get great quality furniture as opposed to getting decent stuff from the stores. But what's interesting about the Amish, I've been trying to read up a little bit on their theology, and it's hard to find. Sometimes you got to find. I found some sources from some of their stores, but what's shocking to me is that not once have I ever been evangelized by some of the Amish. And it's like, if you truly believe that we are lost, the large majority of your neighbors are lost, why hasn't a single person come and outside of trying to sell me corn and green beans and furniture and stuff like that, not one person has tried to evangelize me. So I don't know. We've been building a relationship with one of the Amish that sells us the furniture, and I think that I'm going to approach him about that later. It's like, what do you actually believe, and why aren't you like trying to convince me to join the Amish?
Well, I wonder how much their pacifism plays into that. Like, you take pacifism or just non-confrontation to its logical conclusion. A spiritual conversation with people that disagree with you is pretty confrontational, right? I wonder if that's just part of it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something that I want to get it more into as the longer I'm here. I've just started feeling well again. Treatment stopped around November. Took a couple months just to kind of recover from that. Pretty harsh treatment, because they said this is a really aggressive cancer, so they took a very harsh, aggressive, direct treatment plan. And so it took me a while, and I'm just now starting to feel like my energy levels are back. And
wow.
I went deer hunting, I think late November, so 2 or 3 weeks after chemo and radiation's over, and shot a relatively small sized buck. I mean, it had a decent rack on it, but the body of the buck wasn't that very big. And it took me an hour and a half to drag this thing 100 yards. I would pull it 10 yards and I would just be gassed, and I'd have to lean against a tree and sit down for about 10 minutes. I mean, it was a struggle.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the doctors are talking about the percentage chances of it coming back, which means for now, there's like no evidence of disease. Is that where you are?
Yeah. So as of 4 weeks into the 4 rounds of chemo, they did a scan. They couldn't find any sign of cancer. They did an extra 2 rounds just to be safe. And then they did a spot radiation on the one spot after surgery. There was one spot that showed signs of cancer. It was in a lymph node. And so technically it was stage 3 cancer. And then they asked, should we do radiation or should we not? And I said, well, what's the pros and cons? And they said, well, there's always a chance that a single cancer cell survived that chemo thing in that lymph node and it could spread back. If we do radiation, it would essentially kill that lymph node, and there'd be no chance of it coming back in that lymph node. And I said, yeah, let's go ahead and move forward. The downside is, according to what they tell me, is that the stuff that they did to get rid of cancer, if I survive into my 60s, would probably give me cancer. And sure enough, I went to a holistic doctor a few months ago and had them do a really in-depth study of my blood work and all this stuff. And they found that chemo had actually introduced all sorts of toxic metals into my system. Like there's metals that your body naturally has, and it's always low levels, or normally low levels. But mine are kind of off the charts right now, which is toxic. Like platinum is off the charts, and it's just supposedly not good for your body, and it will eventually cause your body to develop cancer later. But normally people go through chemo and radiation later in life. I mean, normally, but we're starting to see younger levels of cancer in people across the country, and they've linked my cancer was supposedly the result, at least in part, by the burn pits in Iraq when I was a soldier over there. They were burning everything from refrigerators to gasoline to whatever you could burn in these burn pits. And the toxic chemicals kind of drifted up in the atmosphere. Well, at night when the atmosphere drops, the smoke and the toxic chemicals don't leave the atmosphere. They kind of just drift into your camp. And so the place always smelled like burning trash, and I never thought twice about it. But we didn't have buildings that had like filters on them and stuff like that. We lived in tents. And so they're finding that a lot of the young Iraq veterans that had been to these bases are coming down with rare and strange cancers.
Okay. I was going to ask if there's a pattern they picked up on with other guys.
Yeah, they just recently passed what's called the PACT Act in Congress, and it's recognizing toxic exposures to all veterans, including the Gulf War syndrome guys, the Vietnam War Agent Orange guys. But the newest one on the list is now us from Iraqi Freedom. And my cancer was number 2 on the list that they known to be as a result. And it's 2 on the list of this burn pit results, but in reality, that the cancer that I have is like 0.02% of people that have cancer. It's such a rare cancer.
What is it?
It's called technically it's a colon cancer, but it's not the normal type that everybody gets. It's called a manic tumor, a neuroendocrine cancer that is growing alongside of growing in the normal tumor. And so it's very strange. They found it very strange to be found in a colon as opposed to the lungs or somewhere else where it's more likely to appear. And so I went to the James, and the James said they've met 1 or 2 people with it. I went to the Cleveland Clinic, which is a world-renowned cancer center, and they said they've never treated it at all. They've had one person that they know of, or at least that doctor. He's been there many years, and he said, I've only met one patient with this cancer. And he left to a different place to get treatment. So I don't even know what happened to him. So yeah, very strange, very weird kind of situation to be in. But
yeah, it's got to be disorienting for you walking into a place feeling the effects of cancer and having them say, yeah, we don't really know much about it. I mean, that's to hurt, like in a weird way deep down, right?
Well, it's not very comforting. That's for sure. Because, even if it was bad news, you'd want to know, but they can't tell you any news because it's such a rare thing. They don't really know what to expect. But it was found in Norway. We were there serving with our mission board, and I have a pretty poor opinion at this point of socialized medicine. But I had been going to the doctor since April of 2021, I think. And I had been asked, I've been having some digestive issues with what it felt like. And it never went away. It would go away for a couple weeks, but it would come back. And I said, and I kept going back to the doctor 4 or 5 times. I said, there's something wrong. You need to check. And they would do a blood test, didn't find anything wrong. One blood test kind of recognized that my iron was a bit low, and they didn't decide to do any further research and study. In hindsight, what I should have done is I should have went to the private side, because I do have private hospitals there. But I never would have suspected anything this serious. What I was expecting maybe was like an ulcer or some colitis or something like that. Anyway, long story short, I went to the hospital in January. I skipped the doctor and just went to the hospital, to the ER, and they tried to tell me that I was just constipated, and decided to send me home with actually no, first they decided, just by looking at me, they said, you probably have kidney stones, so we're going to send you home with some antibiotics. And I said, wait a minute, like, why are you giving me antibiotics when this is just your guess? Like, you literally haven't taken any vitals. You're just looking at me and saying I have kidney stones. And they just wanted to get rid of me, is what it was. I was filling a ER bed. And I sat there for probably 12 hours arguing with the doctors, trying to get some sort of scan to confirm this guess of kidney stones. And so they did an ultrasound and some blood work, and didn't find any signs of kidney stones. And so they said, well, it's probably not kidney stones. We're going to guess you're constipated now, and we're going to give you some laxatives, and you can go home with that. And at that point, I think I was just kind of upset, and I just accepted it and left. And it didn't work, didn't help. About a month later, I come back in the hospital, and at this point, I wasn't able to eat or drink without vomiting back up. Sorry if that's vulgar for your listeners, but
it's all right. It's real.
I went to the same hospital, to the same ER, and they didn't want to check me back in. I was in the ER, but they didn't want to check me back into the hospital. And so, in the meantime, when I first arrived at the hospital in January, I was vomiting, and so they thought, oh, COVID. So they stick me in kind of this like COVID isolation room where there's like plastic hanging off the walls. I mean, it's such out of ET, like this is just very strange stuff, and never had an issue with COVID before that. But a week after my hospital visit, I come down with COVID. And so now I have what I didn't know at the time was cancer plus COVID, and ended up being just a sniffle for me. My wife, I gave it to my wife naturally, and she had a cough for a few months. But I go back to the hospital, and they did not want to admit me into the hospital and do any more scans. They said, you're just constipated. We promise you. It's what the issue is. And thankfully, there was a doctor from Africa there, a middle-aged lady. I don't know if she was doing in Norway, but she looked at me and she said, there is something wrong with you. Like, there's something really wrong with you. She did some tests, and to spare the listener, she found out that there was I was bleeding internally. and she fought with the Norwegian doctors, she said, and got me admitted into the hospital. And then when I was up there, I had to sit around for 3 days because, it's the weekend and doctors don't work on the weekends in Norway, apparently. And so waited till Monday. They kind of made it the impression that that I was putting them out. But, because they were, doctors, they had to do it. So they did a scan. They saw a big bright red area in my stomach, and they said, well, it's probably just some bad colitis, but we're going to do a colonoscopy just to make sure. And but it's there's a chance it could be cancer, but probably not. And so I was like, okay. And this was a repeated theme in my hospital experience. It's probably, it could be this, but it's probably not. And every time they said that, it just got worse and worse and worse. And at one point, I was like, can you just stop telling me that? Really, just stop telling me, because I'm just going to expect the worst and be, But they did the colonoscopy and found out that there was a tumor there. And next thing I know, like, they took it very serious. Like the whole hospital was like at my beck and call at this point. And
they probably all felt bad for kicking the can down the road so many times, and now it's like, oh, stink, he's bad. So I had this counseling nurse. She was constantly at my side. Well, she was down the hall, but she was constantly there. And they're like, we need to do some more testing. But once we do the more testing, the way it worked out was this: we are going to take some more pictures and some more scans. Unfortunately, you just missed the day that the doctors meet to discuss scans of new patients. So they only meet once a week, apparently. So you need to wait till, this was Wednesday. You need to wait till next Wednesday. They'll look at your scans. And then on Friday, we will call you in. So now we're 9 days away. We'll call you in. We'll look at your scans and tell you like what our suggestion is for treatment, what we're going to do. They're probably going to involve surgery and all this. So now we're 9 days away. And they said, after that, after you're approved, we will give you surgery sometime within 3 to 4 weeks, or maybe it was two to 3 weeks. And so I'm looking at, like, that's a month. That's a month before they're going to do anything. And you're still not able to eat and drink.
I'm not able to eat or drink. I'm like, what are you going to do? They were going to check me out of the hospital. And I said, that's not good enough. I'm going to go back to the States. And they were really like dead set against me going back to the States.
Why?
They said that it would delay treatment. And I said, any more than a month? I highly doubt it. So I think that was a Wednesday or maybe Tuesday or Wednesday. Anyway, I go in the night, I go and I start making calls because Norway's 6 hours ahead. So I start making calls, start looking at cancer centers. Some friends of mine down here told me that, we didn't know it was a rare cancer at this point. We just thought it was normal colon cancer. And the James here in Columbus is world renowned for their colon cancer care. It's kind of like their specialties, and just so happened to be like an hour and 45 minutes from where my parents lived, where I grew up. So the next morning the next morning I went to bed that night. Next morning I woke up. I tell the doctor, I said, look, I'm going to try to leave. And you keep the ball rolling here just in case I can't get out of the country. Because at the time, if you had any kind of evidence of COVID, you couldn't get into the United States. And so we had just had COVID. And so we were worried about popping a positive, not being able to get, because neither of us had the vaccine. So we didn't have ways to get into the country. We're worried about getting stuck in Norway. So you keep the ball rolling here. On the plane, I will call you. I said, I will call you that I'm gone. And long story short, on the drive home, we had like a 20-minute drive home from the hospital to our house. And on the ride home, I called the James from Norway, here in Columbus, from Norway. And within 30 minutes, I had an appointment date for Monday. This was like a Thursday. I had an appointment date for Monday, a tentative surgery date for Wednesday. And so they were going to give me surgery. They had only talked to me on the phone. I sent them my scans a few hours later through some kind of web link they sent me. And by the end of the night, I had a surgery date for Wednesday. The same day that the Norwegians were just going to meet and talk about my scans. They had planned surgery. And I called the Norwegian doctor back and I said, this is my plan. Again, keep the ball rolling and I'll let you know if I can get out of the country. And he was just, I remember him being so awestruck, like, that can't be possible. There's no way they could possibly give you surgery that fast. And then it just dawned on me, like, there's definite downsides to privatized healthcare system like we have, like, but the upside is so infinitely vast.
What I was just thinking about is how often you'll hear in socialized medicine type settings, they can get you in and out. You can just go and you can get your free healthcare and whenever you want. But in privatized, you got to wait forever, and everybody's grumpy and grouchy, and you don't never get what you need. But what you're explaining is like the exact opposite.
It's the exact opposite. Now, to be fair, if you had a cold, socialized medicine is awesome. You just go in, you get your medicine, you're out. You pay I think I paid like $3 for a doctor visit. I mean, it really is sweet. On the downside is if you have something wrong with you, good luck. I know a guy that he broke his leg skiing, and he lived about an hour north of me, in Norway. He broke his leg skiing. It wasn't like a compound fracture, which was extremely obvious, but he heard the snap. And he went to the doctors, and they didn't want to do an X-ray because that was a waste of money. So they gave him Motrin, I think he said, and he said, if it still hurts in 2 weeks, come back and we'll take an X-ray. Sure enough, they comes back 2 weeks later. It is broken. He wasn't, it wasn't in his mind. He broke his leg, and they decided to do a X-ray, and then they put him in a cast. But he sat around for 2 weeks, and just because they didn't want to waste the money of an X-ray. And so there are definite downsides. If you have something seriously wrong with you, you have to, and the Norwegians will even tell you, like, you have to argue with your doctor, because a doctor doesn't want to, be the one that's constantly sending people for more procedures.
And that's what we want as patients, is to go in and have to argue with our doctor for treatment. Yeah, that makes us feel real confident in the whole thing.
Oh yeah.
So that they follow through on that surgery. Did that end up happening then? The date that you said over the phone, you came back to Ohio and got the surgery that quick?
Yeah. So we went and found like the cheapest place we could find to give a COVID test, not because we were wanting to save money, but because we figured that would be the best chance of getting a positive, or I guess a negative.
Yeah, right.
So we got a negative test, and we knew some doctors in Norway that also signed, because we had some at-home tests that confirmed we had COVID, but we didn't go to the doctor and get it confirmed through like an official test or something like that. We had the at-home tests that were free across Norway. And long story short, we get through the airport. We actually did the handicap kind of like service, because I was so weak at this point, not being able to eat or drink for like better part of 3 or 4 days outside of some IVs that they gave me at the hospital. I was so physically weak, and this was on 2 or 3 months of a limited diet, because what had happened was the tumor in my large intestine had completely sealed off the large intestine. Like no food was, barely, only liquid was getting through, and so it was causing a lot of pain. And the danger, they said, was at any moment your intestine could burst, and you would have you'd have to have an emergency surgery. And an emergency surgery, they don't take the care of removing the tumor that they would when you had a specifically cancer surgery, I guess. So long story short, we get back to Columbus. We took the handicap. I got wheeled through all the airports. Without that, I probably wouldn't have made it throughout the airports on time. And so we get through Amsterdam, I think it was either Chicago or someplace. We get through all of them. And
real quick, what month and year are we in?
So this would have been February of 2022. So the end of February.
Okay.
I think.
And you got kids with you at this point too?
No, my wife and I have thus far been unable to have kids. Well, we have a few that we lost in miscarriages. So when people ask if we have kids, we usually just say yes, but they're gone.
Just trying to get the picture in my head of what's going on. So it is, especially because it's Europe, you got COVID madness, even though we're 2 years removed from COVID at that point, but still probably COVID crazy. And your wife is wheeling you around in a wheelchair through multiple airports.
Yeah. Well, the wife was following. They had an attendant to do it. But it is very great for anybody that has issues with airport travel. I highly recommend that as a route. Fantastic. You didn't have to go you had your own passport control. You had your own, so they drove me outside of the airport on a bus. So it was fantastic.
It's worth stubbing your toe before you travel, just to
yeah. And I'll say this, they technically are not able, and they don't ask you what's wrong with you. So I didn't have to prove that I had anything wrong. I mean,
wow.
My family says
they have employees there ready to help, I guess, right? So it doesn't.
Yeah. And it's absolutely fantastic. And without that, we would not have made our gates because we were running late. But I'll say this about Norway and COVID: they had an outstanding response to COVID. They were a little bit like Sweden, where they didn't really do much. But the thing about Norway is, if the government says to do something, most Norwegians do it. So 1 year after the holidays, the Norwegian government said, don't have anybody in your home in like January, February, and March, something like that. And no one did. I mean, it wasn't a law. They didn't say you can't do it, but no one did, simply because the government said that you shouldn't. And so that's why it worked very well for them. They didn't. I mean, we had salad bars still open in grocery stores. We had these candy dispensers where you could just take one of those scoops and grab your own loose candy. I mean, this was during COVID, and they trust each other. The Norwegians trust their government to the point where they just essentially do whatever they say. And so I was trying to explain to the Norwegians how Americans kind of look at that. I said, depending on who's in office, if the president says to do something, there's half the country that's not going to do it simply because they were told to do it. And they can't fathom how Americans are like that, and we can't fathom how they're like the way they are. But yeah, we make it through the airports. Everything worked fine as far as travel. We get into Columbus on, I want to say Saturday. It might be Friday night, but sometime Friday night, Saturday. And I basically sit in the hotel. At this point, I'm able to drink some liquids again because the liquids are still making it through. So I'm basically on those Ensure shakes and water and juice and stuff. And meet with the doctor on Monday. They do another MRI just to confirm all the scans that they had from Norway. And then checked me in on Tuesday, and I had surgery on Wednesday. I mean, it was quick.
Wow. And the surgery was to remove that tumor that they found?
Yeah. So they removed about a third of my large intestine, I think, and they reattached the large intestine to the small intestine. And so because it was on the right side as opposed to the left, I didn't have to wear any colostomy bags or anything like that. It was, but it is so strange how in a major surgery like that, it takes 2 or 3 days to get even walking normally again. They get you up to walk like a few hours after surgery, and you have this walker, and I'm 37 at the time, and I have this walker, and I'm barely able to take 3-inch steps on this walker, and it's so humbling, so humbling.
Yeah, that is the probably the definition of invasive surgery, right? I mean, that is splitting you open and getting down into the guts. Wow.
And supposedly the tumor was so large that the normal incision, they had to double it just to get it out. But the way they did it was they put it in a bag while it's still inside of you, and then they cut it out so that if you would just cut it out, cancer cells could leak. And so they do a very safe job, and then I had a 6-week recovery at home. That's when all the we were hoping for the best, and that's when all the reports started coming in of the biopsies of the cancer itself, how rare and strange of a cancer it was. Naturally, we go to Google. Google has a very, very dark opinion of this type of cancer because, again, it's so rare, and it normally appears in people in their 70s and 80s. And so because of that, there's not very good statistics of the people that do have it. And so, we're freaking out and go to the doctor, and the doctor doesn't give us, that first doctor visit was not very hopeful at all. And then we started chemo in April of 2022, very harsh chemo. And yeah, it was from April to October, November was basically 3 weeks on, 3 weeks, 1 3-day thing of chemo, and 3 weeks later it would start again. So every 3 weeks you're getting chemo. Every now and then you get a scan, and then they did spot radiation. But in all this, I don't want to make it just so naturalistic, but the Lord has been so gracious to us in everything. With that African doctor there at the hospital, if it wasn't for her, I might have been upset at the Norwegians and then went back home. And then it might have delayed my finding the tumor and treatment, because colon cancer in 30-ish-year-old males, extremely rare, extremely rare. I have known of the burn pits issue that way, but it's mostly coming in as like what's been reported anyway, since I didn't study it too in depth. It was mostly brain tumors and lung tumors and stuff like this. Never would have thought of colon cancers or any kind of gastrointestinal cancer. But that apparently is number 2 on the list. And so the Lord has been gracious to that. It was funny, and I got diagnosed in January or February of 2022. In November of 2021, I was asked to preach at a conference in Norway, and the sermon I was given to preach was the sovereignty of God over all of life. And so I remember, because they keep you awake during the colonoscopy. You don't get any medication in Norway for a colonoscopy. It's the most awkward experience. You have the doctors and the nurses, and they're all kind of fascinated that you're American, so they're asking you questions, and you're like, this is not the time or the place.
That is wild. Uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I remember them, they wheeled me out into the hallway after they had discovered the tumor. And they didn't say a thing. They just kind of wheeled you outside the door, and there was an orderly that was supposed to come take you back to your room. And they left me there for an hour. And it was just this hour of processing everything that's happened. We spent, because Norway is one of the most expensive countries in the world, we spent the better part of 4 years raising support to get here. And then we get to Norway, and we had thought that we had come to serve with a church of about 50 people, and we were going to just step into an already thriving church, and it was going to just be a blessing to work with them. And it was a blessing. But what we didn't know, that there was fault lines in that church, that for whatever reason, when we arrived in Norway, while we were still in quarantine, our 10-day quarantine from the flight over, the church decides to split. And it took a few months, because everything Norwegians do is slow. But it took a few months, but eventually the church essentially split 4 different ways.
So,
and
before we go there, I'm just curious, how does an Ohio boy, Iraq war veteran, end up in Norway in the first place? How did that happen?
Yeah, really, it was towards the end of my military career. I only spent 6 years, and I was in the United States Air Force. And so when we say Iraq veteran, my experience was very mellow compared to most Marines and armies and guys like that.
Well, although there's short term, but not long term, as we're finding out, right?
Right. So I don't want to give the impression that I was out slinging lead down in the valleys and stuff. But my job was communications. I was kind of a communications expert. My first tour in Iraq, I mainly kept the radios working for guys. Some people in my unit provided the communications link for the Predator drones and stuff like that. But my main job was, I'm not so much of a techie guy, so I did more of the manual labor. I'd climb the towers, change light bulbs on the top so helicopters wouldn't crash into them. I kept radios working, TVs working, stuff like that.
And you like that? You
I enjoyed the tower climbing more than I thought I would.
I would hate it, man. I would not do well with that.
Yeah, like the reason most people didn't want to do it was because it was they're afraid of heights, obviously.
Yeah, right.
And I think I was just young enough where I think I'm more afraid of heights now, but I'm not really. But I'm more anxious on heights than I was then.
Mm-hmm.
So basically I was one of the few people in the unit that was not afraid of heights. And they asked if I would be willing to do it. I said, sure. And I guess they had a shortage of people climbing. They're actually certified. So they kind of created a certification for me. I wasn't officially certified. I couldn't come back to the States and climb towers. But it was something I did there. I enjoyed it very much. We did radios. I worked on the radios and various things. So I enjoyed that very much. My second time I came to Iraq, I think it was like 12 months later, 15 months later, I was somehow made it into the armory. And so I was like in the armory. So that was very boring actually. But it wasn't bad. So, but yeah, so towards the end of my military career, I was kind of, I don't know, dissatisfied maybe. I've always been kind of a guy that's been dissatisfied with kind of staying in one place too long. I don't know why that's the case. But being young, had I go to do it again, I probably would have stayed in at the very least in the Garden Reserve. But the grass is always greener, I thought, as a 23-year-old and decided to get out of the military. And so I got out, honorable discharge. That's kind of turning the page. Ironically, most of the guys that I was in with, some of the guys that would train me and guys that I've trained, they're now retiring from the military because it's been 20 years. And so that's kind of fun to see them retiring. A lot of them joined the Space Force actually when that opened up.
Oh, wow.
But I started taking some Bible classes actually, because it was one of the things that there was a certain experience that you have in Iraq. Our base would be mortared, I don't know, once or twice a week, something like that, from the terrorists outside in the town called Al Nazariya. They would use. We allowed them to explore our trash. They could have our trash from the base, the citizens of the town, and they would take stuff, and then some of them would take stuff and turn them into things to kill us with.
Just like they would recycle metals and stuff. Is that?
Yeah. So what we found, we found I didn't say we, some of the Australian Army, I think, found where they were launching mortars off with, and the mortars I think they were getting from Iran. I think they confirmed that, but what they would steal from us is they would not steal, but they would take from us, from our trash, is our old bed frames. And so they had these like metal rails now, and then they would take truck jacks or jacks off you jack up your truck to change a tire, and that was their elevation device. And so they would crank this truck jack up, and then they would shoot off mortars. And then the next day they would send. Every day we'd brought in workers onto the base to fill sandbags, to clean, to whatever the case may be. But you couldn't be a worker on our base until you had checked with the Taliban, because if they found out that you were working on an American installation in Iraq without checking with them, they would kill you and your entire family. And so for whatever reason, the U.S. military knows this, but still allows these people onto the base to do the work.
Almost like dealing with children or something. You just give them a little bit of leeway because you're not super scared of them, and so you just let them play with a few things that you don't consider that dangerous and let them do their thing. Is that kind of how that went down?
I guess one of my jobs, I had a 2-week gig where I had to watch a bunch of these guys coming in. You'd have a rifle and you'd basically be a bodyguard for them, not to keep them safe, but just in case they decided to turn.
Yeah, if they went sideways or something, you'd correct
right.
them.
It was, but at the same time, you kind of sympathize for them because they may not want, to do what the Taliban was wanting them to do, but they don't really have a choice because the United States is not going to protect them in their homes in the night in town. And so they don't really have a choice. It's kind of a rock in a hard place. So I did feel bad for them at the same time, but at the same time, you can't allow them to be. What they would do is they would go in there, and they must have had a nice schematic of the base, because they would basically tell the whoever was shooting off the mortars, hey, you missed by this much, and so then the next night they would change the elevation and they would, try again. And they got to be decently good. My second tour, I think it was the Army had just built a brand new gym, like they would all the guys would be working out in, and that gym, the size it was, you could probably have 50 to 100 people there in any one time. And thankfully for us, they blew it up. They hit it direct hit with a mortar 2 days prior to actually moving all the equipment in. Had they waited a week, they could have probably killed dozens of people inside that. But they blew it up too soon.
Crazy.
So anyway, I don't know how I got on that. But one of the things I was doing towards the end of my military career was getting into Bible classes. Oh yeah, that's why. Because I had one time a mortar came pretty close. And it just got me thinking, what would have happened if I had walked, 5 minutes earlier, or had it landed, 20 meters to the right or something. And so then I started reconsidering my faith that I had as a child. I'm not real sure when I was saved as a child. I made a profession of faith at 5 and again at 9. Basically, anytime we had an evangelist that would come in and tell you all you're going to hell, we would all get saved again, because that was our theology. And
it sounds like a Baptist setting. Am I close?
Yeah, oh yeah. Independent fundamental. Yeah, independent fundamental Baptist. So anytime we went to camp, anytime we had an evangelist come in, especially if he had very mean and scary looking charts, we would all get saved again. And so the way I figure is that I think the time at 9 was genuine, but I was never taught discipline. I was never taught how to grow, how to be sanctified. It was all this pray a prayer, get your ticket checked type of an idea. And so even though I genuinely trusted in Christ for salvation, it was never taught to me, or and even basic Bible study, which I'm sure we'll get into the hermeneutics issue later, but even basic Bible study wasn't emphasized. And so I was at best, I was a very immature, shallow believer. But that time in Iraq when that mortar came close was that was kind of the wake up call that I needed. There had been times earlier through various other deployments, but this one mainly was like, okay, I really need to figure this out. Because
were you exercising your faith at all whenever you were in Iraq? Were you going to like chapel things, having conversations with other believers, or was it were you just totally dormant?
No, there was a period of about a year and a half where I was relatively dormant. Nothing was ever guilt-free. There was always conviction. But it was and it wasn't even that the church had offended me. I'm not a recovering fundamentalist or anything like that. It was just that I had been so sheltered from the world that when I got into the world, that what the world had to offer was fun. It was fun. And I think that's something that devalued at my church growing up was, oh, sin is terrible. Sin is terrible. Not necessarily. There is a lust after the world that is real. And I kind of went into that. And again, never.
Just to clarify, you're saying that the church was saying all sin is just makes you miserable, and you're saying no, you were finding out it's actually kind of fun.
Initially, yeah. I mean, there is a truth to that it does lead. Its ultimate conclusion is misery. But going out drinking with your friends is fun.
Yeah, there's a reason why people do it.
Right. And so what I kind of felt like, this is all fun. This can't be bad. And I don't ever remember thinking, I knew it was wrong, but I don't ever remember thinking like, that God is disappointed in me or angry at me or anything like that. It was just, I was so living for myself. That's the main idea. I was living for myself very selfishly. And then just because it was never guilt-free, because there was always conviction there, I think each time I did it, it would become less and less fun. And eventually I remember before the Iraq experience, I had this moment, I think we were in Honduras at the time. And I just remember having this moment of like, you know what? I really got to know if I am a believer and I'm a Christian, I shouldn't be doing these things. And if I'm not, then I should just go into them full heartedly and not care what, kind of try to erase all this conviction that I have, because at this point, neither of them was fun. I would go back to a church, and then I would just be like, man, I really wish I was out drinking with my friends. But then I'd go out drinking with my friends, and I was like, man, I just really not having fun doing this anymore. It's just,
it goes back to that chronic discontentment that you say you have.
Yeah, a little bit, I would say. And so long story short, I was like, you know what? I need to figure this out. And so I wrote in, and the way you figure it out, in my opinion, at that point, was not to listen to anybody, was to go and really determine what I believed. And so I picked up a Bible, started reading. At the time, I'm still King James only, because that's what I've always been taught, right? All those NIVs and ESVs and all those are heresies. So I'm reading the King James Version, and I'm like, man, it's a bit difficult. I'll admit at the time it's a bit difficult to really understand. I'm reading classics at the time, John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, stuff like that, and started taking a couple Bible study. It was the Introduction to the Bible courses, New Testament. I remember it was a school in Oklahoma. I was stationed in Oklahoma primarily, and I think it was Oklahoma Baptist University in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Took a course on New Testament introduction, and it's just utterly fascinating to me. I guess I had just never thought about the books of the Bible were written in a time and a place. And what really hooked me was the professor had a good 2 or 3 day session on how Alexander the Great did more for the New Testament setting than possibly anybody else in history. And just so fascinating to see, because I was always a lover of history, how history kind of tied into to Bible. And
were you still single at this time?
Yeah, I didn't get married until much later.
Okay.
Married at 31.
So you had all your time here where you could just dive in.
Yeah. So that started eating away at me. Was I really had this desire to continue this studying the Bible. I think that dissatisfaction with the military was kind of building. I enjoyed the military. I loved it. But the longer I was in, the more I was dissatisfied maybe with what I was doing. That I guess the way to say it, there had to be something more. And so left again. If I had to do it, I would have stayed in, at least in the Garden Reserves while I was going through school. But I left, and at this point, again, I'm a very raw, around the edges person. The military kind of culture does that to you. One of my first jobs afterwards, I remember my boss coming to me, and thankfully her dad had been a Marine, so she kind of understood me. But she's like, "Nahum, you can't talk to people like that." It's like, what do you mean? It's like, you just can't say those type of things in the typical work environment, because it's not how it's done here. And I was like, oh, and it kind of dawned on me that I had been changed a lot by the military culture. And
what kind of stuff? Just like a straight shooter? That
would be one.
Okay.
Like, so there, I remember this person came up to me with an idea, and I like that person, and I still have friends with that person today. But I remember just saying, like, no, I just said, I think this is what I exactly said. That's stupid, man. We don't need to be doing that. Like, that was just, I called his idea stupid, which apparently is akin to calling him stupid. So he went and complained to the boss, and the boss pulled me. I mean, it's just this big thing. And then there was a young lady that I was working next to, reminded me a lot of my sister, and there was a guy I was friends with at the college, and I was like, you and him would be a good match. And she was like, "Oh, I appreciate that, but I have a boyfriend." I was like, "Well, I can fix that." I just kind of said that, and oh man, like that was yeah. Obviously, I was joking. That was just a passive aggressive way of saying, "Oh, good for you," never mind. But that was not the way to say that, apparently, and
it was not appreciated by the workplace.
Right. So it wasn't overtly bad things or anything like that, but and I think at the time I'm still young at the time. I was still 20 something and young by our standards today. 200 years ago, I was halfway through my life.
Right.
But anyway, I leave, and I didn't know what seminary was good. I mean, my IFB background told me like Jack Hyles, told me, oh, this stuff like this, Hyles Anderson College or Pensacola Christian College. Yes, and I'll be kind to them. That's where my wife went to school, because she's also IFB, that I found out later. But yeah, so I was done with the standards, I think. I remember there was a school in Oklahoma that I thought about going to, and they told me that I had to dress a certain way, that I couldn't date anybody unless they had approved it. And I mean, it was just all these rules. And I think I was just done with that, especially coming out of the military. I was just done with that. And I wanted to just be myself, in a sense of no one telling me what to do. And I wanted to just study. And so I would probably, it's not the worst choice of school, but I'd probably change it if I could today. But at the time, they were very military. They still are very military friendly. But I went to Liberty University.
Okay.
And one of the clinchers was that they said, hey, with using the GI Bill, you could go through aviation school as well at the same time you're going through Bible school. And I said, you mean the military or the VA will pay for me how to learn how to fly a plane? They're like, yeah. And so I decided to do that, double major. That was like the hook in, because there's a lot of the aviation department was basically staffed by old pilots in the military. And so I felt at home there with them. And so, yeah, it was double majored in biblical studies, and I think it was missionary aviation, I want to say, and did a few years of that. And then when I was near graduating, I kind of had to make a choice which route you want to go. And I wasn't interested in being an airline pilot or anything like that, so I was more considering the missionary route. But come to find out, there's always a need for missionary pilots, but the need is not as great, because the largest organization at the time said they were only hiring 1 or 2 new pilots a year. And we had like 50 pilots in our school that were wanting to go to missions aviation. And so I decided to kind of pursue the master's degree or seminary as opposed to going through aviation. So I think I dropped my because I filled the credits for my biblical studies degree faster than I filled them for my aviation degree. So I think I'm 3 credits or 3 classes short of an aviation degree. But then I finished my bachelor's, went straight into seminary. And
so real quick, you have a pilot's license?
Yeah. I got I got a private pilot's license. It's one of the most fun things I've ever done. There's no feeling like being in a plane by yourself piloting.
Again, the heights thing. I don't know. Commercial is a bit of a stretch for me, so I can't really imagine doing that.
But like I'm more afraid of flying now than I ever was then. And the reason is, like, now that you know how easily things could go wrong. And then I know people that I went to school with that are now pilots in the industry, and you're just thinking, like, I wouldn't, if I saw that dude on my plane, I would walk off the plane, because I know that guy and I don't want him piloting me. And so, yeah, it just kind of dawned on me, like, there's poorly trained, in the same way that there is bad pastors and good pastors, there are bad pilots and good pilots. There are bad doctors and good doctors. And so that's one of the things I learned back then. But yeah, so I have a private pilot's license. I was most of the way done with my IFR rating, the instrument rating, but that's when I had to make a decision to graduate or continue aviation. Yeah. So I haven't used it since. The last time I flown was 2013, and I kind of considered it was fun to do, but I'm not interested in paying the amount of money that it takes to do that now, to continue that. So that was fun, and went straight into Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary. Essentially went. I think it was a 72-hour MDiv. I was poor. I was poor at choosing classes at the right time, and so I was 5 classes away, I think, from graduating with my MDiv, and I think it was 3 Hebrew classes and 2 Greek classes. So it was either going to be a really bad semester, but I don't even know if you could do them all in the same semester because they kind of built off one another. So I was probably looking at another year at least in seminary, or again, there was that kind of thing where like dissatisfaction with where I was. And I was kind of wanting to move on to the next page. And so they offered to cash me out with a 60-hour master's degree. I don't know if that was a wise decision or not, but I took it and graduated. And around that time, I was being kind of recruited by various agencies to plant churches and do this stuff.
So what kind of churches were you going to while you were doing the Liberty thing? Did you switch out of the IFB world and start dabbling in the SBC world?
So when I was in the military, and after that experience in Iraq, I came back to Oklahoma, and I decided I was going to go to the first church I saw. And so as I drove out of the base once,
okay,
again,
Jeff, though, with this sacrificial vow.
Yeah. So again, this is my knowledge level at the time, right? So I'm going. It ends up happening. I end up going to a relatively large Southern Baptist church. That was the first one. It was right outside the gate of our church or the base, and so I went there and ended up being a really good time. Met a lot of great friends there. The Bible study and the Sunday school class I was in was far more impactful in my life than maybe the pastors were. So I never really got involved because the nature of my job with the military was I was gone all the time. I'd be back for 2 or 3 months, and then I'd be gone for 2 or 3 months, so whether you're training or whether you're deploying or whatnot. But so that kind of opened me up to, I remember getting Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, reading through that, and it's like, I've never been taught this. And just theology in general, I've never been taught. At best, it was, read your Bible through in a year. Even if you don't understand it, you get to check that off. And so I remember going through his systematic theology and just thinking, this is great. That was the first time I started hearing names like John MacArthur or John Piper, or you name it. I was at one point in time, I was going to Sam Storm's church.
That was there in Oklahoma. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yep, Bridgeway, I think it was called. And that was the time he was having that evening of eschatology with Doug Wilson and John Piper and
Jim Hamilton.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And because I remember Sam Storms getting up and saying like, "Hey, we're going to have this discussion at John Piper's church." And at the time, I was like, I don't know who you are. I don't know who John Piper is. So I started really finding out about all these people, and I would check with my IFB pastors that I grew up with, and they would always warn me, like, you don't want to be listening to John MacArthur. He's crazy, stuff like this. And so I'm evaluating some stuff, and so as I get into seminary, start again learning more about theology, and I don't know where you stand on the doctrines of grace or anything like that, but that's when I realized that, again, everybody that was Calvinistic were heretics, according to the view that I grew up in. And then I started realizing that all the people that they had told me to read, even my IFB churches, John Bunyan, Spurgeon, all these guys were heretics. And so I was like, why are you telling me to read the stuff that you... And it just dawned on me one day that I was a Calvinist. It was kind of a depressing day, actually, because I just kind of dawned on me, like, yeah, I believe in the depravity of man. I believe all these doctrines of grace truths. I see them in Scripture. That's what, of course. But then it kind of dawned on me that, oh no, I'm a heretic. So I'm going through this, and that, to be fair, that wasn't even Liberty's fault. That was just personal study, because I think at best Liberty would be considered a 3.5 point doctrinal school. So it, through all that experience, then it became, when I went to Liberty, I started going to Thomas Road, that church that kind of built off of it. And I was just helping in. I was just trying to get plugged in. Again,
was Thomas Road where Jerry Falwell Sr. was?
Right. And then at the time when I was there, I think he's still there. Jonathan Falwell, his son, took over.
Okay.
So I was just getting back into church, honestly. Outside of that, by nature, kind of a nominal existence in Oklahoma, because I was always gone on deployments and stuff. Getting back into being a regular attender at church, getting involved in teaching Sunday school, and doing things like this. And then at some point, there was a church nearby in what's called Big Island. I think it technically was a Southern Baptist church. They asked if I would come lead their youth group. And so while going through seminary, I started doing that ministry. And it wasn't too long before seminary was over, and wanting to know what I would do. I was still single and I was still young. My interest was preaching and teaching. And then I kind of realized that, as a single man, especially, pastor roles are very difficult because of you have a limit of your understanding of family dynamics and stuff like that. And then people just look at you differently when you're not married. When you're a single man, they look at you. You could be one of the wisest men in the world and you're still going to be considered immature. And it's just because you're single, honestly. And whether fair or unfair. But then a missionary friend of mine, he's now my pastor here at my sending church. He was at the time a missionary with the ABWE, the Association of Baptists for World Evangelism. He was a missionary with them to England, had been so for 30 years. His parents were ailing, so he had come back. And he had said, why don't you consider Western Europe and missions? Because what Western Europe needs is faithful biblical teaching and preaching. And even though you're single, you could work alongside of Norwegian pastors and stuff like this. And so that led me into ABWE. And what attracted me to Norway is that it's it is a very needed mission field, and there is not a lot of faithful work going on there. And so that's what led me to Norway, raise support. When I was raising support, I went to one IFB church actually, and that's where I met my future brother-in-law and sister-in-law. And the wife, Amber, she kept looking at me very strangely throughout this whole missions conference. And I mean, it was awkward, just very awkward. And
have you told her this, or is this going to be new?
Oh yeah. No, this is definitely, this is, she knows this. And I was playing with, they had 3 kids, and they have 4 now, but at the time they had 3, and I was playing with their kids, and I've always been, good with kids. And so I think the next to last day, or the last day of the conference, they approached me, Amber and her husband JP. They approached me and said, we have a sister back in Missouri that we'd really like to tell about you and introduce you guys if okay. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? And so they went home and told Aaron about me, and we started talking on the phone, and 6 months later we were married.
Wow.
So that's how I met Erin, my wife. And yeah, since then it's been a whirlwind, man.
She joined your life while you were already on the track to Norway.
Yes, that was my first question to her, actually, in an email. It's like, are you open to going to Norway? Because if not, there's no reason for me to talk to you. I mean, she responds by saying, like, I've heard it's cold there. And
yes,
and I said, yep, but they make very good coats. That was kind of like the start of our conversation. And come to find out that one of the reasons Amber and JP had thought I'd be a good fit for her is because she was also going through her own post IFB struggle with faith, and currently she was holding to the doctrines of grace as well, and so we thought that they thought I would be a good fit for her, and sure enough we were a great fit. We got married 6 months later, and just lots of good stories about meeting her family for the first time in Missouri,
I'm curious the dynamic, because I mean your name is Nahum, so you had to have Christian parents, right? I mean there's just no way you get that name without Christian parents,
right.
And you were in the IFB world growing up. She was in the IFB world growing up. Presumably she has IFB type parents, and you both kind of moved out of that world, became Calvinists, and have deviated in your views of certain things, though obviously still Baptist. What's your relationship like with your families there?
Good. And again, part of it is because, and I won't say this is across the board, although it's more typical than it should be, most IFB participants don't really know what they believe. They know what they're against. But I've preached John 10 before, very early on when I was going through my own kind of transition. That's a bad word to say nowadays, but when I was going through,
Yeah,
kind of
you
like,
didn't used to be Natalie O'Brien, did you?
no. So I was preaching through John 10, and I wasn't using because I didn't know them at the time, but I was using words that weren't, your typical tulip words, because I didn't really know those at the time. To this day, I haven't really, so I've studied a lot of authors, but at that time I had not studied very many known Calvinistic authors. The most I had done is I had started reading Lloyd Jones long before I realized who he was. And when I was in the military, I would listen to John MacArthur from time to time because he was always on the radio. Again, no idea who he was, his background, his theology, anything like that. I would just listen to him. And so as I was preaching through John 10, I realized later that what I had preached was very Calvinistic, very Doctrines of Grace. And the church I was preaching it in were all amening me. Everyone was amening me, and no one understood what I was saying. In fact, I had a woman come up to me, and she was like, are you like, very softly, are you a Calvinist? And I said, yeah. I said, I think so. She's like, I am too. I said,
wow,
like
a secret society.
Yeah. And I was like, what are you doing here? She's like, oh, my husband's IFB. No, but in some ways I'd still consider myself independent. I would still consider myself fundamental, at least by the historic definition of fundamental, the fundamentals of the faith. And then I would still consider myself Baptist, obviously. And so, I mean, I think our parents think we're a little bit weird. I think that would be some ways because one of the things that's changed is how we approach certain situations. Like I'm not into attractional evangelism. I'm not into sometimes our theology affects the way we work. So for instance, my church here recently, the Sending Church, I started somewhat interim pastoring and preaching at a local supporting church here since January. So I'm not longer in my Sending Church. But they would do stuff like Halloween things and stuff like that. And I'm just not into that. I don't
like
find them
Judgment House type stuff.
Yeah, stuff like that. I just don't. And again, I'm not going to say that it's wrong. I just don't find it being very fruitful.
Yeah.
And so my parents kind of, my parents are different than my wife's parents, but my parents, they just kind of do what, quote unquote, the man of God says to do. So if the man of God says, hey, we should do a trunk or treat or a haunted house or a blow up community festival or anything like this, they just, that's what they should be doing. And I'm the type of guy where like, no, it's okay. I don't really feel like doing that. I only have so much time and energy, and I don't need to be devoting it to stuff that's extra biblical. I'm not saying it's unbiblical, but it's extra biblical and not necessarily needed. And for instance, the church we're pastoring right now, we don't have Sunday evenings, and particularly because, they had stopped it during COVID, but they had never gone back to it. And so when I transitioned, they asked when I became their pastor, they asked what I would want to do. And I said, I am more than happy for you to use your Sunday evenings with your families and intentional. Don't just let it be flippant time, because then at that point we're just wasting our time. But make it intentional about being with your families and having the Lord's Day, celebrating the Lord's Day with your families. And so again, it's neither here nor there, but at best we could say it's not mandatory Sunday evenings. And so that would be one thing. But I think my parents would still look at me like you're not going to church on Sunday evenings. That's terrible. That type of an idea. My wife's parents would be more, they were in an IFB church, but I don't think they were ever truly IFB, like I in their hearts. So I can't speak.
They didn't ask Jack Hiles into their hearts. Okay.
No. No. And to be fair, when I was growing up, I had a relatively moderate IFB pastor. I still have a world of opinion of him, and I think sometimes we can go too far and to be bashing the men in the IB camp, because there was a lot, and still are a lot, of faithful pastors in that world. And I learned to take the scriptures seriously through him. Unfortunately, he left when I was still 9, I think. So it was very, maybe 10 or 11, but he was there, and I still remember him preaching, after he left, I think he was a Bob Jones graduate, and that's who I got my books from. He when he retired and was getting ready to pass away, his son gave me all of his dad's books.
Wow!
And so that's where I found in his library he had Oliver B. Greene and he had Martin Lloyd-Jones, and so there was just a wide range of stuff in his library. But yeah, so after he left, right in the time I was joining junior high, that's when we got the serious IFB pastors that were like, the church I was growing. Again, this is a town of 6,000 people, or a city of 6,000 people. The church we had was like 500 people. It was a huge church. And since that pastor came in, I want to say the early 90s, that new pastor came, the church went from being like a 500 person church to like a 140 person church. And it was because you couldn't sing in a choir unless you had a tie. He would follow guests out into the parking lot and say, "Hey, if you're not wearing skirts, don't come back to our church." Like, what are we thinking here?
He had heard of a new church growth strategy. And it didn't work out.
And one of the pastors I remember very vividly commenting on the people that were leaving, and he said, "We're just trimming the fat off of our church," and they were leaving over silly things. And so it was at the time. I mean, I was still young and I was in high school, and so I didn't really care. I mean, to be honest with you, and so I didn't. It was only afterwards that you're thinking back to growing up in church and just how bad that was. And so, but all that to say is I don't look back on my experience with regret. I could have been better, yes, but at the same time, they gave me a love for the Word of God that
they're the ones who led you to the Lord, right?
Right. They led me to the Lord. They gave me a desire for His Word. We would disagree on a lot of things, but at the end of the day, the gospel was preached, and led me to the Lord. So I'm friendly with the guys at like the Recovering Fundamentalist podcast and stuff like that. They were kind to me when I came back from Norway with cancer. They sent love offerings and stuff like that. So but at the same time, I couldn't officially join them. I think at one time they had to ask about joining my podcast with theirs, and I just couldn't officially do it because I didn't want to be known as someone who was upset at their IFB background, and not to say that they always are, but it's the kind of the impression that they give off.
I mean, you kind of define yourself when you name a podcast or a ministry that way. You kind of define yourself as someone who's anti something,
Right.
Yeah, I get that for sure. So when did you, jumping now back to getting to Norway, when did you land in Norway? Was it before the pandemic times, or
we had reached 100% support? I think it was in February or March of 2020, or whenever COVID hit that same year. And so it took a couple months to get our permits and our passports and all this stuff ready. And not our passports, we had those, but our permits from Norway. And then while we were waiting on our permits to be approved, COVID hit, and then everything locked out. And so we sat in Missouri on the farm, which is a great place to ride out COVID, was on the farm.
I hear you. Yeah.
And so we lived in Missouri for 6 months, I think, and we couldn't get to Norway. And I want to say it's September 2020. I want to say that's when we arrived. Is that when COVID happened, 2020?
Yeah. And it was March when everything started to hit the fan.
Right. So so then we wouldn't have left until September of 2020. And so we didn't get there. We weren't there very long. And we were just kind of thinking about this the other day. We have been back now for almost about as long as we were there. And man, when it was our story in Norway, we told to some of the leadership of our mission board, and a few of them commented like, we have never heard of anyone having a worse 18 months than you all have. I mean, obviously there is worse, like, death and stuff like this, but
right.
But just the conglomeration of everything that had happened in that time period was just horrible. Church splits to just lies and all sorts of stuff it was just crazy. And then cancer on top of that.
And let alone the entire society being in flux because day to day with the pandemic situation, things were changing. And
Oh, and then we were so excited to get to Europe because I'm a traveler. I love traveling. I've always loved traveling, and we were so excited to get to Europe because now it's like driving across the river here and going to Kentucky. I could get to Germany. I could get to Sweden. And everything's shut down, so we couldn't go anywhere. And we could go around Norway, but outside of that, we couldn't go anywhere else.
Had you learned the language already and everything?
We're about 50% proficient. So
Okay.
if I hear a conversation between Norwegians, I could probably get the gist of what they were talking about. But I probably couldn't translate for you fluently. So
yeah.
Because of that, long story short, we're not going back to Norway, at least at this time. And the reason is I need scans every 3 months. I'm set with my doctor here. It would be a terrible time to not only get permits again, but to get over there, get into a doctor's visit. And because there's such a high chance of it reoccurring, I'm not going to get treatment there. And to be honest with you, I don't trust them to even do the scans. And so we decided to stay here. Actually, this 2 weeks ago, we officially made the switch. We're now missionaries to North America. I think they kind of knew my situation.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're going to help you just be where you're planted right now. And so we've switched over to North America. And I think the idea is we're going to be serving and working along pastors and churches in the Appalachian region, kind of what we're doing now.
Kind of like with revitalization work, or
yeah, working with revitalization, working with the church I'm serving in right now. What's really interesting is how God has kind of worked this all together. As I said, when I was sitting out in the hallway after the colonoscopy that discovered the cancer, I was eerily calm. It was so calm. And the thing that was coming to my mind was the sermon that I preached in November of the sovereignty of God over all things of life. And that all the points in that sermon had come back. And it's like, you know what? God is absolutely sovereign over this. There's no reason for me to be fearful, to be upset, to wonder why. And those are all the questions I was coming on. Why in the world would you send us all through that work of raising support, send us over here only to give me cancer 18 months later and for me to go home? But it was just so eerily calm throughout the whole hospital experience. And then as we left the hospital, my wife and I were leaving the hospital hand in hand, and I was seeing people that were walking around town. Their lives had not changed. And when we got into the car, I lost it for about 5 minutes. And I'm a very even keel person. Like I think of one of those EKGs or something going bouncing up and down. I'm like the dead. Like I'm just always even keel. But when I lose it for about 5 minutes, and then I'm back, back to normal. And I lost it for 5 minutes. And the main question on my mind was why? Like why? Not an accusatory sense, but just I want to know what's going on. Like
yeah.
And I remember I had this feeling like God is if this is the end, why? There's so much more that I could have done for you. There's so much that I had to offer. And it just kind of went back to that sermon, and then what really happened is I started thinking about the book of Job, and I remember it took a few weeks of processing, of course, because we had a lot going on, especially during that 6 weeks after surgery. You're kind of sitting there, you're processing information, and at the end of the day, I had to come to a point where, if God would require my life now, at this point, when I theoretically could have done so much more, but God requires my life here and now and calls me home, am I okay with that? If that's how God has chosen to glorify my life or glorify himself through my life, am I okay with that? And at the end of the day, I had to say yes. Now that doesn't, what I found is there's a war between your emotions and reality. And in reality, I'm okay with that. When I allow my emotions to take over, that's when it gets to me.
Were you in the headspace at that time? Like, so you come back, you get the surgery, you start going through the chemo stuff. were you in the headspace then of I'm probably going to die? It seemed more likely than not you were getting ready to die.
Right. That was the more probable thing. Like I didn't know. I remember very vividly having in April of 2022, after surgery, before chemo, I remember having this experience. This might be my last birthday. Like I remember vividly having that, by God's grace, I've had another one since then. But yeah, I just remember
that'll follow you around like a dark cloud if you allow it to just every single day think this might be the day that I die, and that really starts to seep into every aspect of life. That can really mess you up mentally.
Yeah, for me, it was very strange because for years I've kind of walked around with that cloud for years. It's like, what's going to get me? There were times when I didn't think I'd make it out of Iraq. There were times when, there just very times where you're like, man, what? I might not make it out of here. And so I've kind of, I'm okay with that. Death doesn't necessarily bother me. It's more so like stuff that come up from that idea. So for example, all the assurance issues I had as a teenager, they all came back. And there was a month where I struggled with assurance. There was moments of being dissatisfied.
Assurance of salvation.
Right.
Just because you didn't think you had demonstrated enough of true belief, or what was the issue there?
It was just irrational thinking. It was emotions and these things that I had struggled with as a teenager. When you're making all those decisions for Christ every time a new evangelist came to town, all those came back. And then what I realized is you can't trust your emotions, and that makes your thinking irrational, and you have to stick to truth, what the Bible says, what we know to be true. And if you allow the truth to maintain your emotions, you're fine. But if I allowed my emotions to dictate how I felt about the truth, that's when I would lose it. And so far at this point, I can say by God's grace that most issues I'm fine with now. Like there's one thing that still bothers me. It's the thought of my wife getting remarried to some other dude. I cannot get past that.
Really?
I mean, the theoretical thing I understand, but the thought of it drives me nuts.
Yeah.
Like if I could somehow know the future and I did pass away and I know that she would get remarried, I'd probably go knock off that dude. Like it would. That drives me up the wall to this very day.
So when in 2020, it's interesting. We were talking about how you were on the Missouri farm there for 6 months as you were waiting to get over to Norway. We got infected in the end of June. Start of July 2020, right when we left on a 30-day sabbatical. I get another sabbatical this year, but that was my first one ever. And day one of the sabbatical, we tested positive. And we got it pretty bad, dude. I mean, I got it worse than she did, and I still have effects from that. I mean, it messed me up.
You probably got an earlier version then, because mine was, I think, one of the variants that kind of spun off of it.
Yes, we got more of the fresh off the boat version, and it had me really messed up, and I went through an extended period thinking I wasn't going to make it, because when we got back after 6 weeks on a sabbatical, I came to my doctor with a list of 10 symptoms I had at that time. And he said, well, let's just order them in priority and start looking at them one by one. And I had to go to a neurologist and had to see specialists for some stuff. It was a crazy time dealing with that. And as I was thinking about, okay, I might not make it. I mean, COVID kills people, and perhaps this will be what takes me. I remember, thinking through, what if Melissa gets remarried, and thinking, yeah, good for her.
See, we had polar opposite reactions to that.
Because I thought, if she died, I know I couldn't make it on my own. I'd want to get remarried, and and I've had to tell her, because she's definitely more of your mindset, where she can't ever imagine being married to someone else. And I've told her, multiple times, get remarried. Our kids need a father, and you need a husband, and it would be good for her. Good
if roles were reversed and my wife passed away, I would probably spend a good 5-year period on the road with a dog.
Yeah,
That's
what you say. But I don't know, man.
Yeah, I could be wrong. But I'm not even like, I have not tried to persuade my wife or anything not to get remade or anything like that.
Sure.
In the back of my mind, I'm okay with it because it's natural.
But totally understand the mental block, though. I mean, that's understandable.
I can't think about it. I don't want to think about it because it drives me insane to have some other man loving my wife and something like that. It's just,
yeah,
it fills me with rage. But,
well, let's move on real quickly before you smash something.
No, but I'll say this. God was so good. When I was sitting back here going through chemo, I'd go to church every now and then. And by that I mean, like, my immune system was low, so I was supposed to be kind of avoiding people. In church, you have large groups of people, so I would typically show up late, get into the back of the service if I was feeling well, and then slip out before the service ended, like during the the invocation or something like that. And I just remember thinking, like, man, I really want to preach again. I really, really want to preach again. Because I had not yet been able to really go through a large series with in any of my positions as a youth pastor, as a even in Norway and stuff like that. And so I just started praying for an opportunity, and I got a few opportunities to preach, and my sending church when I started feeling better. But then there was a church about 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away, whose pastor I knew. He was a supporting church pastor. His wife died of cancer 2 years ago. And he had never taken a sabbatical, never took a day off. He was kind of, he might have taken a few weeks off, who knows, but he never allowed himself to grieve. And long story short, he was having a crisis of faith. And he asked if I'd be willing to step in and take over in January of 2023, whenever he resigned. And so he resigned. I've started preaching at this church, and the first message I preached was the same one that I preached at that conference in Norway. Because it's easy to say on one end that God is sovereign over all things while your life is relatively going okay. It's a completely different thing entirely to preach that God is sovereign over all things when you don't know if you're going to live, to see 2024.
Yeah.
And so I preached the same message to myself and to others, that God is completely sovereign, and I have cancer, and that is okay. I think back towards the Gospels, and you see all the apostles, man, they had 3 years of intense discipleship training with Jesus. They walked with him all over. And when he's ascended into heaven, they're commissioned to go out to do the work of ministry. And man, you see John going out, and he has an amazing ministry. You have all the apostles, according to history, going off to various places, starting churches. You have Peter doing his thing. And then you have James. And James, within weeks, months, is killed on the steps.
Yeah, Acts chapter 12.
Yeah. And you think of all this stuff that he could have done, and he's killed on the steps. And it's like, am I okay if God has that route for my life? Where you have all this, possible stuff you could be doing, but he decides to take your life early on and somehow glorifies himself through that. And at the end of the day, I had to come to this realization: yes, it's okay. I know that mentally, and then you had to let it seep into your emotions. And so I decided to take that church and kind of an interim role. Lord willing, it may turn into something more permanent as the Lord allows me to live. And but what's interesting is that about every other person in that church either has cancer or has someone in their family that has cancer.
Wow.
And so it's almost as if God has taken us out of Norway and placed us in a situation where this church needs us, my wife and I, and we need them. And we are walking this road together.
Amen.
One of the reasons a lot of people in that church have cancer is because there's an old nuclear power plant nearby that a lot of them worked in back in the 60s and 70s, and it gave all of them cancer. And so we buried our first individual about 2 months ago now. and there's at least 4 or 5 other people with cancer in that church, and it's a smaller church, around 60 people. And then you never know. Some people are recovering from cancer, and so we're walking down this road together. And maybe it's just because I'm a glutton for punishment, but I decided to preach through Job. And man, we are going through the book of Job, and we're realizing that God has every right to do whatever he pleases. And no matter what, whether we have a good report this month or a bad report this month, and we've had both at this church, we had good reports and we've had bad reports. And we praise and glorify God because he's worthy of our trust, and he's good and he's just. And so it's been a wonderful book to go through. It is kind of a dark book to go through consistently. So we're taking a small break for the summer to go through one of Jesus' sermons in the Gospels. And so
I'm assuming not the Olivet Discourse. You're not going to take a break from suffering to talk about tribulation.
No. I might have overstepped when I said sermon. I think we're going to the passage where he's telling, where he asked Peter, "Who do you think that I am?" Okay. And Peter says, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." And he says, on that truth, on that rock, we're going to build our church. I'm going to build my church. So we're going to talk about that kind of scenario, that situation. And it's very positive, very. Even that section in the end where he said the gates of hell should not, overcome it or not prevail against it. I take, maybe it's a minority view, but I don't view that as the evil kingdom. Jesus promising that the evil kingdom of the evil one will not destroy the church. I take that as gates are defensive in nature. And so what Jesus is saying is, as I'm building my church, and I'm making no eschatological opinions here. This is just
sounds like you're teeing up post-millennialism.
No. I honestly, I could not say. I do not know where I fall with eschatology. I find them all to be incomplete in some ways. And so, but what I'm saying is that when I view that passage, I see Jesus as promising, at very least, the disciples that the gates of hell are not going to prevent my church from growing.
Yeah.
And so that's how I view that passage. That the disciples are going out into a lost and dark world, and they are going to be essentially taking over from the kingdom of the evil one by stealing, but conquering people, bringing them into the kingdom. If you want to play that out in an eschatological sense, that's your prerogative, I guess. But at the very least, Jesus is making that promise to the disciples. And so it's going to be very encouraging, very promising, because, a lot of the churches here in the Appalachian region, and for anybody listening, that's how you pronounce Appalachia. It's the Lascia. And someone's not from Appalachia when they call it Appalachia. And so this is the Appalachian region, and the churches here are really declining. It's one of the worst regions I've read of all the country as far as people that actually attend church. So a lot of churches around here back in the 70s and 80s were very large, and now they're dwindling. So
I know, at least for West Virginia, general population is declining. I was looking at the census data whenever it came out last, and Utah, percentage wise, is the fastest growing country or state in the country.
Really? Why's that?
A lot of Californians, it's like a pit stop on their way to, I don't know, greener pastures. They end up going to Texas or somewhere, but a lot of people come out of California wanting a conservative refuge that's more affordable. And for now, on both of those things, even though we're evolving on both of those fronts, Utah fits the bill. And so we have a lot of LDS people who are moving back after going away for college and work and everything else. They want to come back here and raise their family here and stuff. Gotcha. But I saw on that census data the last time it came out that West Virginia, I think, was the only state in the union that is actually declining. They went negative with percentages, I think, or maybe they were just super duper low, but they were at the bottom as far as growth goes.
Yeah.
So, I know it's right next to Ohio, but it's not Ohio. So I don't know if that's something you've been seeing too, is just generally the place shrinking or what?
Probably. One of the reasons is there's not a lot of great jobs. And if you're not in the medical system here,
coal
or teaching, a lot of the industry here is left. We do a lot of coal plants. We had a lot of coal plants. A lot of even our atomic plant is kind of they're shutting down. It would take many years for them to shut down, but it's shutting down. And so a lot of the good jobs have left, especially like technology jobs. There's nothing like that around here that I know of. And so, yeah, so where I live is in the tri-state region, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio all together.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the place I live. So we have a unique culture, even unique from Ohio, because most Ohio is Midwest, but we don't really have a Midwest culture here. We have a more of an Appalachian culture.
Bluegrass, snake handling, overall wearing.
there are churches nearby in Kentucky that have snake handling that I've heard. So yeah, it's not uncommon. But you have a sense around here, at least in the Appalachian region, of, as was typical in past generations, is kind of a glorification of ignorance. Like you were considered more spiritual as a pastor in some of these small churches if you didn't have education, because
I'm
you're
just a podunk simple boy who loves Jesus, and that's like your cred.
Right. And I don't know who said it, but someone said once that people love certainty over truth, and that's very true around here. There's still a large amount of people around here that are King James only, like not preferred. I'm okay with people that prefer that translation. Sure. By all means, even there are some people that are even convinced that it's the most accurate. By all means, but there are some that are like, it's double inspired. If this is legitimately, you'll hear this around here. If it's good enough for the apostles, it's good enough for me type of an idea. I mean, they have just no understanding of where their Bible came from. That I've recently discovered right here in the town I'm living in right now of Minford, Ohio, there's a pastor who is a hyper dispensationalist, and he preaches that the old saints were saved by grace and works, that they had to do work in their way into, and it's like unreal, unreal that that's still around here. But it's the Appalachians. I love it. It's so family oriented, which can cause problems in churches because there's like 3 or 4 families in a church, basically.
Two-edged sword for sure.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's, man, we love our traditions, and they are hard to break, hard to break. But yeah.
Well, so as you were headed to Norway, or maybe during your time in Norway, that's when you became more interested in Bible interpretation, I guess, because something we haven't mentioned this whole time is that you are the host of the Hermeneutics podcast, and I'm not sure what the future holds for that, but you want to just walk me through how you got into that and where it's headed?
Right. So it really began while I was raising support for Norway. I had a lot of time on my hands as a single missionary. So you can't, as a single missionary, they don't stick you when you go to a church to preach and to present your ministry. They don't put you up in a family home because the husband might leave and now you're home alone with these wife and kids. So that's inappropriate. So they always give you a hotel room, or they put you in a house with another single guy.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of downtime when you're raising support as a single guy. And there's only so many national parks you can visit. And so
true.
one of the things I did was I started a doctorate program, a doctorate of ministry. And the emphasis of that doctorate of ministry was going to be hermeneutics, or biblical interpretation.
Wow.
And so by the time we got married, by the time we got to the farm in early 2020 and COVID hit, we didn't really have anything to do but just wait. Everything was already done. Our support was raised. Everything was done. And so part of my project was teaching hermeneutics in the local church. One of the things that was never done when I grew up, I figured we do it intrinsically, I guess. When I've noticed, and other people have noticed, that the people in the church tend to interpret the Bible the way the pastor preaches.
Yep.
So if you're preaching that, as one famous evangelist in the IFB world does, that David's 5 smooth stones have something to say to us, and what that says is that that you ought to dress well for church, you ought to pay your pastor well, you ought to go door-to-door knocking, you ought to do all these things. That's what David's stones are telling us today. If you're preaching that from the pulpit week in, week out, your people are going to start interpreting the Bible that way. And
the pulpit steers the church.
Right. Yeah. And so I thought it'd be good to maybe help churches and to develop a program that you can take your church through how to teach them the Bible. Obviously, COVID struck, you can't do that. And so I didn't really think about doing it for the doctoral program. I just thought, I have all this stuff that I've been doing, might as well do something with it. So I started a podcast really off a whim. I didn't really think anything would come of it. It was just something to do, honestly, during that time. And so I started just recording episodes of teaching basic hermeneutics. And I personally, it's still not like a massive podcast by most standards, but I'm getting 1,000 downloads per episode, something like that. And it's way more response than I've been getting lately. I'm stalled recently. I think I'm in season 4 or 5. I'm kind of stalled largely because of chemo and stuff. I'm going to be picking it up here soon. One of the major things was, while you're going through chemo, you can't think. You just can't think. And my writing was terrible and my thinking was terrible. It's only been in the last 3 or 4 months that I've been able to think clearly. Wow. I just started noticing I used to have some really quick wit, and that was kind of declined as well. And I've just started noticing that coming back. So now I feel more comfortable. I typically don't do interviews like this that kind of off the cuff, because I've never been necessarily a quick thinker. It's always been more of a slow, but especially after chemo, it's been even worse. But now I feel like I'm getting back to normal, and we have a house now as opposed to living in a camper, and so it's stuff's becoming more stabilized. So I hope to, and all my books were lost, so I bought a bunch of new books because our stuff that we sent back from Norway, our friends, thinking they were being kind, and they were being kind, chose, because we left everything there. They packed up our house for us, and they picked the cheapest company they could find, thinking they were doing us a favor. And they're very kind. I'm not slamming them at all, but just the way it worked out, you get what you pay for. And so this company took 12 months for our stuff to get back. So we just got our stuff maybe 2 months ago. And so,
and I had all your stuff,
everything except for like 6 suitcases. And so we just got all of our stuff back. We had rebought a lot of things. And so now I'm doing all these book giveaways on the podcast because I had rebought all my books.
Okay. Gotcha.
And
so,
now
so you got, so just so I'm clear, you got everything. It took forever, but you got everything except for 6 suitcases.
Yeah. So the 6 suitcases are what we took with us when we left.
I see. Okay. But everything they packed up and sent, they actually ended up there.
Yeah,
I was thinking you were going to say they lost your books.
Oh no.
Okay,
we got rid of a lot of stuff because it was super expensive to ship.
Okay.
So everything that we had accumulated in Norway, all of our furniture and stuff like that, we just sold there. Ended up taking a huge loss on everything, but because the way the Norwegians are, they don't really buy a lot of used stuff because they're an extremely wealthy nation off the North Sea oil. So you could buy, for instance, a china cabinet made of solid oak simply because it's not the style there anymore. Everybody likes the IKEA junk. So you can get a solid oak china cabinet for probably less than $30.
Wow.
I mean, it's just immaculate looking thing. And just because it's no style anymore. So we had a lot of stuff that not in style because it's still kind of our style in the States, that we just couldn't sell. But it takes a year to get all of our stuff back. So now I have all my podcasting stuff back and things like that. I hope to open a startup again. I think we're currently in a history of interpretation. That's been a fascinating study before chemo or cancer came. And I think I'm going to start doing more interviews and more book reviews and stuff like that on some of the hermeneutics books that are out. But yeah, so hopefully we can get that up and coming again, started.
How have your views of biblical interpretation changed? How have you changed in the realm of hermeneutics through that side ministry that you've had?
Yeah, one of the major ways, again, with some, not all, but some of the pastors I grew up under in the IFB world, it was all topical preaching. that was, again, not all. I don't want to throw everybody under the bus, and some of them are very good. I'm not saying the topical sermons are bad in general, but it wasn't expository, it wasn't expositional, and you could get basically anything you wanted. I remember very vividly one of the pastors preaching a sermon on Peter seeing Jesus post-resurrection, jumping out of the boat, swimming to Jesus. One of the things he does before he jumps into the water is he puts his cloak back on, or some of the garments that he has, and he jumps into the water. And the point of that passage, according to this pastor that was at our church, was that we should dress our best before we come to church, before we come to Jesus. Hence, jumping into the water. I mean, even then, not knowing, not being educated in biblical interpretation, I was like, that's a fetch. like that.
He didn't say that he had Peter had a Windsor knot on his tie, did he?
No.
See, you always go full Windsor, never half Windsor.
Yeah. I've been told that there were some churches that would even you could have wire frame glasses, but not plastic frame glasses or something like that, because they were like hippies back in the day. But yeah, so one of the things that it's just, I become more, one of the things I always appreciated about John MacArthur is, and I really don't know enough about him to really have an opinion, to be honest with you, one way or another. One of the things I really appreciated about him, and one of the things that brought me more into Reformed theology, at least the doctrines of grace, was that the way they approached the scriptures, that the scriptures were king. They didn't have a point. They didn't have a thing that they were trying to preach. They inserted into the scriptures, but whatever the scripture says, that's what the point was. They had a really high emphasis on authorial intent, and that's what that's the major change, I would say, in how my approach to hermeneutics is. I no longer have an idea of what I want to say, and then I'm somehow making the scriptures say that, which is very easy to do and very clever. Hence the David's five smooth stones said. I mean, it's just unreal. He would go from David's stones. David picked 5 stones. There's a sister verse to this passage, whatever that means. And that is when Jesus is walking into the triumphal entry, and he says, if these people stop praising me, the stones would cry out. So if Jesus says stones can cry out, then maybe David's stones have something to say to us today. And that's what he said, dress well, pay your pastor well, stuff like that.
Man, that's so much harder than just normal exegesis. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, the time and effort that it took to formulate that. Why not just say what the text says?
That's right. Yeah.
And so then there's another case where same man, he was preaching a message where the disciples were told by Jesus to stay here and pray while he went on to pray himself. And he was criticizing the disciples for not following Jesus into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray with Jesus. Like they stayed where they were. And one of the Gospels doesn't make it clear that Jesus commanded them to stay or told them to stay. And so he was preaching from that particular Gospel. And I said, but the Synoptic Gospels, the other Gospels make it clear. And I actually had a phone call with this gentleman. That the Gospels make it clear that Jesus commanded them to stay there and pray while he went on. So they were doing what he told them to do. So your entire point and the points he was making in the sermon were good. We need to be close to Jesus. We need to be praying. We need good points. But the entire way that you're modeling your interpretation is you're going against what the actual Gospels say happened. And it just, so I think the biggest point that I'd come away with is allow the scriptures to speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And if that brings you to some uncomfortable conclusions, then you need to either address the conclusion that it's coming to, or find ways to harmonize it with other portions of Scripture, which is where your systematic theology comes in.
So you've essentially graduated from eisegesis to exegesis. That's been the change.
That's a fair assessment. Yes.
Good.
So that's been the largest change. To be honest with you, I'm still unsettled, or how should I say this? I can no longer call myself a dispensationalist, even though most of what I understand would be dispensational, because there are certain portions of scripture that I read that make better sense to me, from maybe like say Matthew 24, for instance. It makes better sense to me from a partial preterist point of view than it does from a dispensational point of view. I'm not saying that one or the other is right or wrong. What I'm saying is, in the same way that if I'm going to refer to myself as something, take a name for myself, I better be certain that I hold to that. And that's why I say, like, what I find interesting is dispensational hermeneutics will criticize, well, let's say Reformed hermeneutics, and saying stuff like they don't take it literally, and then the other side will say the exact same thing about the dispensational guys, and so one of the things I'm really important about now is being fair to both sides, because I kind of view myself kind of in the middle right now, as far as I don't know where I'm going to land, but I'll land, and I'm what I'm saying is when I see a dispensational interpretation of Matthew 24, and I find that the partial preterist view is more convincing to me, there are other passages where I look at this side, I say, no, I think you're making some very large leaps, whereas the dispensational side makes better sense. And so that's where I'm kind of at right now. What I'm passionate about right now is just making the elementary principles of hermeneutics known.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, both sides would claim to be authorial intent, would claim to be, let the scripture speaking for themselves. And so that's what I'm passionate about, not necessarily. And then there's just debates everywhere. I recently, when I was going through chemo, I realized that the Reformed Baptist crowd was all up in a bunch. You had, was it James White that was up with, what's his name? Both were guests on my podcast. Richard Barcelos. Yeah. They were kind of upset at one another with apostolic interpretation and stuff like this. And so thankfully, I think my head was so in a fog with chemo that I never really got into that. And it kind of died before chemo was over. So I never really got to engage in that. But yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now. It's just, I want those scriptures to speak for themselves. And in the same way Martin Luther said, you have your conscience is bound to what the scripture says. And I think that's important for people.
Yeah. And that's I got that up above my computer monitors on my bulletin board, a little pennant that my wife got for me. My conscience is captive to the word of God. Martin Luther, 1531.
Yeah,
that's it. That's good. If you need a resource that does a deep dive on dispensational hermeneutics, I know of a podcast.
Yeah. I was actually encouraged when I actually saw your guys come out, and I had always wanted to do kind of a collaboration. But then cancer hit, and I've listened to a few of yours, some in preparation for this, but also just in the past. That's really the only thing I've been able to do for 2022 was read, watch movies, listen to podcasts. I didn't feel like doing anything else. And even that. I've been doing a lot of reading, and now that I'm back into one of the reasons I haven't really got into podcasting like full time again was I think I'm able to do something, and then I'm reminded of how much I need to recover.
Your limitations in your mind and your limitations in your body are a bit different. You bump up against those limits when you set out to go do something. I'm wondering, do you call yourself a cancer survivor?
I'm not at this point, because they don't say you're truly in remission until 5 years.
Can you? Okay, so wow, 5 years. So you're thinking maybe if you get to 5 years while having these clear scans, every 3 months, you said, doing scans?
Well, the first 2 years they'll do every 3 months. After that, they do 2 years of every 6 months, and then the last year you have one scan.
Okay.
And if you make it 5 years, they say that if you can get 5 years and the cancer hasn't returned, chances are it's never going to return.
Okay.
At least not that cancer. You might develop something else. But that's when they declare you in remission. And in fact, but I'm also kind of again, probably the military side of me is I don't buy into these like, I'm gonna try and be cautious just because there might be cancer people listening to this. For instance, the ringing of the bell after chemo treatment. I didn't ring it because I find it silly, personally. I know it means a lot to some people, so I'm not, saying that. But for me, the fight's not over with. Mm-hmm. The fight is not over for 5 years. Why am I ringing a bell right now? And so that was my mentality at it. But
I also, in that same vein, I really have always been kind of turned off by the whole, kick cancer's butt kind of mentality. Like, okay, we're gonna kill cancer. Like cancer is this actual, I don't know, almost human entity that we're battling with, and we are going to prove ourselves victorious by our own strength. There's like a lot of that kind of vibe in the cancer fighting community that I've never been comfortable with. And I'm sure, we would articulate things the same way with the emphasis on the sovereignty of God. Like cancer is God's cancer. He's in charge of this, and we submit to what he brings.
And listen, cancer is terrible.
Yeah,
absolutely terrible. But at the end of the day, I think of it two ways. First is a naturalistic explanation. In the history of the world, there is no better time to have cancer than right now.
Yep.
200 years ago, I'd be dead.
15 years ago. I mean, things changed so much. Yeah.
Things changed so much. You're right. And at the end of the day, I'm almost 40 years old. I'm 38 and some change. I have lived a better life in 38 years than 99% of the history of the world. I have nothing to complain about. Nothing. I am so blessed. I live in one of the best countries in the world, especially for medical treatment. What really sad to me is when you see the children. They've never had a chance to live. They never had a chance. I mean, they don't even know what's going on. They don't even, that breaks my heart to this day. But at the end of the day, I've lived a good and full life. God has been so blessed. God has blessed me so much. Most people, I was given by the mission board essentially a 9-month sabbatical. Just rest and heal. Get through your treatment. Most people that you meet in the cancer centers, they have to work. They have jobs. They have our supporting churches have been so kind and blessing us financially. I don't think I've really spent any money on my own medical bills yet. And because people have blessed us financially. So we've been so blessed by the church, by God's people, with good health. I mean, it is a comfort that I'm outside of cancer was a relatively healthy young man. I mean, I have responded to chemo and stuff probably better than if I was in my 60s, 70s, something like that. So it's been a blessing. The VA has stepped up with the PACT Act, recognized that my cancer is responsible or linked to the burn pits. They have now taken over my medical expenses, as well as made me disabled. I even have a handicap license plate now. I told the ladies in my church that I'll be fighting them for the good spots at church now. So we are so blessed. And then and on the other side of things, and the spiritual side of things, I wrote an article for our mission board. It was saying that there was 4 points that in my theology, God is sovereign. God gave me cancer, or at least allowed me to have cancer. He is walking with me through this battle with cancer. He has a purpose for giving me cancer. And at the end of the day, God has taken far more suffering off of my plate than I could ever imagine. Like there's a reason why the apostles call it this light and momentary suffering, affliction. This is nothing compared to what Christ has taken from me. And so I can honestly say, by the grace of God, at this point through our study of the book of Job, like Job says, yet though he slay me, still I will trust him. That's where I'm at right now. And that's only by the grace of God. And so I have no reason to complain, no right to complain. One from a natural standpoint, from a just a kind of observation standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint, we have been so blessed by God. And he deserves glory, honor, and praise. And if I get my next scan, and I think it's July 6th, if I have my next scanning July 6th and the cancer is back, he is still worthy of our glory, honor, and praise. And so nothing has changed as far as our relation to him. And whether I live 40 years or whether I live 70 years, 80 years, in reality, it's but a blip in history, you know, as far as our lives that we are going to spend with God for eternity. It's but a blip of time. Wow. And so at the end of the day, though it would be sad to leave this life early than maybe expected, at the end of the day, I'll be with him. And so not to say that I'm standing here, 100% a godly mentality all the time. There are times when I allow the emotions to kind of overwhelm me and get the best of me, and it makes me think temporarily. By and large, by the grace of God, I've been able to kind of keep my mind set. And so we're thankful and we're blessed. And in some ways, and you probably experienced this a little bit yourself with your COVID scare, there's ways that I think now that I never did before cancer. There are things that I appreciate now. Mowing grass right now is the most fun experience for me. I never thought I'd be able to mow grass again. And I'm out there and I am happy as a lark when I'm out there mowing grass right now, because it is just such a blessing. The sunrise have never felt better. The sunsets never been more sweeter. And so there's a way that I view the world now and I view God that I never had before. And in some ways I wouldn't want to change that. And so it's been very blessed. Yeah.
It's good stuff. Well, this is going to come out well after July 6th, probably September sometime. So you may need to go back and listen to your own words.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And that's what I'm thankful for this church right now that we're serving in, because there are people that are in remission. There are people that are currently going through treatment, and there's one that I've already graduated to glory, to use that phrase. And then there's one man that just got diagnosed last month with cancer. So, man, we are walking through this journey together, and God is holding us. So it's good.
Man, well, thanks for sharing your story today, Nahum. Appreciate you coming on and giving me all your time.
Sure. Thank you, brother. Anytime.